I'm Steve Wilkerson. I'm with David Royse, Executive Editor of the News Service of Florida. David, Senate President Don Gates and House Speaker Will Weatherford seem to be getting along famously, really do, and there's a very civil attitude going on between the House and the Senate. But on some priority issues, when you kind of get down into the weeds, there are some differences emerging between the chambers. Explain, please.
Right, and that always happens. And, some people thought, well, this might be an interesting legislature because, as you mentioned, they come in with Senator Don Gates and House Speaker Will Weatherford saying they're basically on the same page. And they are on the surface. They have the same priorities, a lot of the same priorities. Ethics reform is, sort of the top priority for each of them. But the approaches on some of these bills, including some of the most high-profile bills, are different. And the House passed a couple of these last week that we can point to as examples. The House passed a bill, its version of how to change the Florida retirement system. The pension system, better called retirement system for state workers, because they're trying to move it away from a sort of old style pension system, like our grandparents had, and more to a 401k type of system like most of the private sector has already gone to. And the way the House would do this is they would close the old defined benefit system to new state workers. Only those going forward, those in the pension system now, would continue to have a choice, as state workers do, between a defined benefit and a defined contribution plan. But going forward, there would be no more, for new workers, no more defined benefit plan where you get a certain, you're guaranteed a certain amount at retirement. It would be a plan that's tied to the market. This is, for obvious reasons, there's a desire to do this, to save money, and to inject some predictability into the system. I mean, with a with a defined with a defined benefit plan, that you only pay out as much as the money is available to pay out. So the House would do that going forward. The Senate has a different approach, and they're not very interested in closing the defined benefit plan. They want to keep it around. They would try to coax new state workers into the defined contribution plan, the more 401k style plan, by providing incentives like saying we would take less of your paycheck, 2% instead of 3%, if you do the more 401k style plan rather than the old style pension plan. So that's a key difference, and one that the rhetoric sounds like the Senate wants to hold out on. So that's kind of headed for a showdown, if you will.
Well, in past years, especially say when Jim King was president of the Senate many times had a more moderate tone to it in many areas of legislation. The House would come forward with a proposal that had an edge to it, and then it would be moderated by the Senate. Maybe that's what's happening now.
Yeah, it's still the case. The Senate may be a little less moderate than it used to be. It has moved to probably more conservative. But yeah, I think that is still the case. And I think that is maybe what you're seeing there. There's another issue there, campaign finance. This was another bill that passed the House last week. I think the most dramatic sounding thing about this bill is the change in individual contribution limits. Right now, a legislator runs, an individual can give $500 to that candidate. This bill would change that to $3,000, which is a pretty big change. Not as big as the House initially wanted. Initially, they had proposed $10,000. The proponents of this in the House argue that the money's there anyway. People are given that kind of money anyway. They're just going through these third-party organizations, committees of continuous existence, these sorts of a little bit more murky organizations that then funnel the money to the candidates. So that kind of money is being given anyway. By increasing the individual campaign limit and getting rid of these other types of organizations, maybe you increase the transparency. But the Senate doesn't want to go along with that very large increase in the individual contribution limit. I think one of the things they're concerned about is the optics, the soundbite. We've raised the campaign contribution limit from $500 to, a couple of $1,000s or whatever. It doesn't sound good, doesn't play well in headlines. Sounds like we're putting more money into the system because you don't get it down into the details of that. Particularly on campaign literature, very often hard to get down into the nuances of legislation. And there's some concern in the Senate about doing that. And right now, their bill doesn't increase the individual contribution limit at all. So there's another place where the details are different. And those are two of the big issues before the legislature and the Senate and House almost halfway through the session. And they're at odds on those two big issues.
Last week, Dave, we talked about the idea of banning or doing away with these internet cafe casinos.
Right.
That idea had been gaining momentum, and last week the House essentially passed legislation that would do that. What's happening in the Senate?
Again, this one is a little different from the other story. I think this is a place where the Senate and the House are going to pass the same legislation. They're going to do it pretty quickly, and it's going to go to the governor. The internet cafe bills are largely the same. They, as you say, already passed the Senate. The House. The Senate will take that up pretty quickly. Both chambers want to get in the same place on this and get that bill to the governor. I think there was some embarrassment about this industry. The industry has given a lot of money to legislators, and I think there was, when people said for years and years, these are storefront casinos, and they had some apologists in the legislature, and now the state's law enforcement arm is looking into these organizations and arresting people, lots of people involved with them. And it turns out that the money's not going where they thought it was going. And I think there's some embarrassment in the legislature, and the reaction was pretty swift. I think this one passes the Senate, goes to the governor well before the end of the legislative session. I think it'll be a slam dunk.
Thank you, David. For more news about Florida politics and government, visit the Advances section of our website.